Welcome to Animology, a podcast about language, the animal-related words and expressions we use every day, and how they shape and reflect our relationship with animals. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I am your host. You can find me at ColleenPatrickGoudreau.com and this podcast at animologypodcast.com. Of course, be sure to subscribe to Animology at Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And thank you for sharing this podcast and leaving ratings and reviews. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word, and your support makes this podcast possible. You can become a supporter, a patron, in the truest sense of the word by going to patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau, or you can hit the donate button at ColleenPatrick-Goudreau.com. Today's episode is Don't Get Fleeced or Pull the Wool Over Your Eyes, expressions from the hair of sheep.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
What you just heard is the reason you're all able to hear my voice today. It was the very first audio recorded by Thomas Edison on his newly patented invention, the phonograph, in 1878. Well, let me rephrase that. Edison patented his new invention in 1878 and indeed recorded those little lines, but it was thought lost. So he recreated the recording in 1927, and that's what you just heard. Mary had a little lamb, his fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Now, just as an aside, that original recording from 1878 was recreated amazingly by scientists at the University of California in collaboration with the Library of Congress using optical imaging. So you can actually hear that early recording from 1878, most likely the oldest recording of an American voice, at my website on the page for today's episode at joyfulvegan.com. But what you heard was the recreation of Edison recreating that recording in 1927. So what's the point of all of this? What does this have to do with animology? Well, not only was this early sound recording a precursor to the digital recording we now know and love so much today, the real point as it relates to today's episode is that that little nursery rhyme is probably one of the most familiar pop culture references of the word fleece. Mary had a little lamb, his fleece was white as snow. And incidentally, that nursery rhyme was written in 1830 by one Sarah Josepha Hale, whom you've heard me talk about in my Food for Thought podcast related to Thanksgiving, because she's the reason it's a national holiday in the United States, Sarah Josepha Hale, and she's the reason turkeys, unfortunately, are served. So fleece. Fleece is the name for the coat of a sheep. And I think the best way to differentiate it from wool is to say that fleece refers to the animal hair from a sheep or even a long-haired goat still on the animal or not yet shorn from the animal and processed to become fiber or yarn, which we call wool. You may hear people refer to wool as in the fine, soft, curly hair forming the coat of a domesticated sheep when it's still on the animal, doing the job it was meant to do. And we say hair and even fur as well, but we really tend to use the word fleece when referring to the entire coat, not the individual hairs, and we don't use the word fleece to refer to the processed fibers, to the yarn made from a sheep's coat. We say wool. And if you have questions and concerns, as many people do, about the animal welfare issues related to wool, I invite you to listen to my Food for Thought podcast episode called The Shearing of the Sheep. No doubt some people will be asking that question in response to today's episode, so I've already covered that issue in the Food for Thought episode. So we say wool when referring to the fabric made from a sheep's coat, but we do say fleece when referring to a fabric as well, a fabric called polar fleece. Polar fleece is a synthetic fabric. It was invented in 1979. It originated in Massachusetts together by two companies. It was created by two companies. One, the company Patagonia, the company still exists today, and a company that is now called Polar Tech. Polar fleece, it's an insulating fabric. It's made from polyester, and it's used to make jackets and hats and sweaters and gym clothes and hoodies and blankets and outdoor clothing. It is indeed superior to wool in almost every way. It was made for that reason to be a superior alternative to wool. Though, as a human-made material, polar fleece is basically a type of plastic, namely polyethylene, terephthalate or terephthalate, PET, which you've seen on the bottom of plastic water bottles or plastic soda bottles. That's what plastic water bottles are made from, is PET. Although technically PET can be recycled, it uses non-renewable resources such as petroleum to manufacture the raw materials in the first place. So in response, a number of companies are buying up bottles and containers and using them to create eco-friendly polar fleece products, eliminating the raw petroleum, which is a primary ingredient in virgin PET plastic, and of course, turning plastic bottles into wearable fleece reduces the number of bottles in landfills. So many companies are doing this. You can just search for that. But Patagonia is really leading the way. They have a huge selection of recycled polar fleece products on their website. And what's more, they're really committed to reducing waste in general. So not only can you send your Patagonia clothing to them to get repaired, you can also send any Patagonia products you may have just sitting in your closet. And they'll accept any product at any time. You can also shop a section of their website of gently worn and repaired clothing. So now that we've clarified what fleece and wool are, I'd like to talk about the words themselves and English expressions made with these words. In other words, etymologies. Just like many of our words for domesticated animals, you can listen to the Etymology podcast episode, Old English Pigs, Old French Pork, fleece is an Old English word. It came from a West Germanic word, though the origins of it are uncertain. It's probable, but not definite, that it came from the Proto-Indo-European root plus, P-L-E-U-S, meaning to pluck, which is also the source of the Latin word pluma, from which we get plume in English, as well as feather. Both of those words, pluma from Latin, which became plume in English, and feather, which is an English word, both come from that same Proto-Indo-European root to pluck. Now, remember Grimm's Law, we talked about this in a very early episode. The consonant shifts between Latin and Germanic languages, like English, they may have the common Proto-Indo-European root, but the Latin P changed to an F, as in Frank, in Germanic languages, which is why the words plume and feather are related. They're both cognates of the same Proto-Indo-European root. Now, there's another popular reference, or perhaps I should say literary reference, to the word fleece, of the word fleece, and that's in the story of the golden fleece from Greek mythology. I touched on this story in the Zodiac episode because this story is the basis for the name of the constellation Aries. I'm referencing all these other episodes because I like to make connections for you so you can keep drawing one long thread through all of these episodes. The story about Aries goes that the fleece, the coat of the golden ram Chrysomalos, was stolen by Jason and the Argonauts as one of Jason's quests. And Chrysomalos, the ram, this golden ram, had saved 2 children from being sacrificed as part of a ritual killing. So in honor of him, this ram, Zeus put the ram's golden fleece up in the skies, where it still appears today as the constellation Aries, the ram. So today we have expressions such as go in search of the golden fleece, which means to embark on an adventure like Jason and the Argonauts did, often one that is very dangerous or challenging. So that's an expression we still use today, in search of the golden fleece. A more common use of the word fleece, however, is in the verb to fleece, as in to cheat or to swindle or to strip of money. And when fleece became a verb in the 1530s, it had a literal meaning. So you had fleece, the noun, referring to the sheep's coat. In the 1530s, you get a verb to fleece, which meant literally to strip a sheep of his fleece, of his coat. So to fleece meant to strip a sheep of his fleece. And 30 years later, by the 1570s, that verb took on the figurative meaning to cheat, to swindle, to strip of money. So you can see the connection there, and you can fleece someone, you can be fleeced, or you can be a fleecer. All of these words coming from the noun fleece, referring to a sheep's coat, then becoming a verb meaning to strip the sheep of his coat, and then that verb shifted to have the figurative meaning to strip someone of their money, to con or trick someone out of their money. Synonyms for this verb to fleece are to cheat, to rob, to con, to steal, to rip off, to stiff, to defraud, to swindle, to take to the cleaners, to take for a ride. And interestingly, 2 etymologies. You've got to rook. To rook someone is to con them. And another expression that's not really common around my parts, to sell a pup. Have you heard that one? It's an informal British expression that's also a little old-fashioned, so you might not be familiar with it, but it's similar in my mind to other etymologies, such as a pig in a poke and to let the cat out of the bag. The origins having to do with an old swindle, where one person would be sold a bag. A poke, by the way, is an old word for a bag. So one person would be sold a bag purportedly containing a piglet, pig in a poke, right? You've got a pig in a bag, but which actually contained a puppy. Or in the case of let the cat out of the bag, it's allegedly from the practice of substituting a butchered cat for a pig when sold in a sack at a market, so it was concealed. The person buying what they thought was a pig couldn't see that it was actually a cat. So letting the cat out of the bag means that you prove that you were sold something you didn't actually want, something of lesser quality than what you thought you were buying in the first place. It was concealed before it was revealed until the cat was let out of the bag. That's the meaning of that. Similarly, to buy a pup or to be sold a pup has a meaning to trick someone into paying too much for something or into buying something that is worthless or of little value. Not that puppies are worthless. Puppies are not worthless. But of course, if someone thinks they're buying one thing of value, which people would consider a pig to have because they would be killing and eating him, only to realize later, after it's too late, that it's worthless, again, from the standpoint of the expectation, then you can see its meaning to be sold a pup, to buy a pup. In all of these cases, you were tricked into buying something that isn't what you thought. You were fleeced. You were sold a pup. You bought a pig in a poke. Of course, instead of any of those expressions, animal related, you can just say I got swindled, I got had, I got taken, I got cheated or conned, or I was sold a bill of goods, none of which have to do with animals in bags or animals stripped of their coats. But another verb with these meanings, to con someone, does have to do with animals, and that's the verb to rook, meaning to get some money off of someone in a deceitful way, or to get something from someone by deceitful trickery. The swindler himself can also be called a rook, and I just want to clarify that the meaning and origin of this word rook in this context is totally unrelated to the word rook as in the chess piece, or also called the castle, and it's also unrelated to the root of the word rookie, as in a newbie, neither of which are related to this meaning of the word rook, to swindle. Unfortunately, to rook, someone in the sense of cheating them, comes from the bird, the rook, a word for a gregarious crow. I've talked in the past about how the birds belonging to the corvid family, the crows, the ravens, the jays, the jackdaws, these are my favorite birds, but they're also the most maligned and misunderstood. As humans, we constantly assert that we're superior to other animals, and then when other animals act like we do, we judge them for it, and we make generalizations about these animals based on a single characteristic. You can see this in many pejoratives we have for animals, just to name a few, narrowing pigs down to being dirty because they very intelligently cover themselves in mud to stay cool, and narrowing cattle or sheep down to being stupid because they're herd animals and thus, very intelligently, stick together for protection. And in this case, narrowing crows or ravens and rooks down to being treacherous or dishonest because, well, they do have a penchant for plundering the nests of other birds for their eggs and for stealing and gathering things like cloth so they can use them for their own nests. And so a person who defrauds or cons people is called a rook. It's not as common a term today, but it is still in use, and it is an etymology, so it is worth talking about in the context of someone getting fleeced, someone getting rooked, someone getting swindled. So moving away from expressions with or uses of the word fleece in the English language, we have many expressions with the word wool. The word wool is an Old English word that may originate from a Proto-Indo-European word meaning to tear, to pluck, as in plucking wool from a sheep's body. To pull the wool over someone's eyes is to make them blind to the facts, right? To deceive, to hoodwink. The origins for this expression, to pull the wool over someone's eyes, has to do with powdered wigs worn in days of yore, which would have resembled lamb's wool, those white powdered wigs, although the wigs would have been made from some kind of animal hair, such as horse or goat or human. And so when you pull the wig down from the head, you pull the wig over the eyes, you blind the person. Thus, you pull the wool over someone's eyes. It's recorded as early as 1838. Non-animal versions, to be hoodwinked. To dye in the wool, or for something to be dyed in the wool, means that it's thoroughly and profoundly imbued with something. It's permanent or firmly established, often used in describing a person's political or cultural or religious beliefs, or to emphasize their commitment to something. Someone's political beliefs are dyed in the wool. It refers to staining raw wool fibers with dye before they're spun into thread, making the color more permanent and durable. Non-animal versions include bred in the bone, deep-rooted, deep-seated. To go against the wool is an expression meaning to go the wrong way, especially when everyone else is going in one direction, you're going in the other. It has to do with going in a direction contrary to the direction in which the wool naturally lies. A non-animal version that's probably more familiar to you is to go against the grain. To gather wool, or wool gathering, is an old phrase going back to the 1550s. It means indulging in wandering fancies and purposeless thinking, to be in a dreamy or absent-minded state such that you dilly-dally. Like, we're in a rush, there's no time for wool gathering. We're in a rush, there's no time for dilly-dallying. It's from a literal practice of gathering loose tufts of wool that had gotten caught on bushes and fences as sheep brushed by. And here's an example of people talking about wool on the coat, as the coat of the living animal, of the animal, who has the coat fully intact before it's been sheared off. So in this case, you have wool referring to the coat itself. And so the idea is that the task of gathering these loose tufts of wool was so tedious that the people assigned to it would have been so bored as to turn to daydreaming and wandering aimlessly to while away the time. So daydreaming, dilly-dallying, that's the idea. Woolly thinking means that your thoughts lack clarity or coherence and substance, referring to the dense nature of sheep's hair, so woolly thinking. More cry than wool. This is an expression I have never used in my life. It's very interesting, I think. More cry than wool. It's also all cry and no wool, or great cry and little wool. There are expressions that mean to make a great deal of fuss or noise or fanfare or protestation over something of little or no substance or importance or relevance. There's lots of expressions we use without wool that say the same thing. All wool and a yard wide is a figurative expression that means of a person that they are very honorable, of superior quality. To say someone is all wool and a yard wide means literally the meaning comes from the referring to the quality of the fabric and of full measure. So all wool and a yard wide. And finally, wild and woolly is an expression that means barbarous or lacking culture. It originally referred to the Western United States, where I am, on account of its lawlessness and untamed nature. And apparently it has to do with the fact that Western pioneers wore sheepskin coats. So this could be apocryphal, but the idea is that here in California, it was once considered wild and woolly. It's an expression that's still hanging on a bit today. It's not very common, but there it is. And before we close, we have a word from lana, the Latin word for wool, and that's the word lanolin. It's built from lana, wool, Latin word for wool, and oleum for oil. So lanolin, as you may or may not know, is the fat or oil extracted from sheep's wool, used as a base for facial creams and ointments. Do you remember that cream called oil of Olay? My mother used to use that religiously. It was created in 1952 by a chemist who used the name oil of Olay. He chose the name oil of Olay as a spin on the word lanolin, a key ingredient. Lanolin being the fat from the coat of a sheep. And so we're going to end it there today and save for another day all the words and expressions that come from sheep and lambs. But today I just wanted to focus on fleece and wool. And so now you know where these expressions come from, what they have to do with the animal, how fleece, the verb to get conned, what that has to do with an animal. And now you know, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and your comments. You can certainly email me through my website, ColleenPatrick-Goudreau.com, or you can just leave comments and have conversations at ColleenPatrick-Goudreau.com on the page for today's episode. Thank you for sharing this episode. Thank you for leaving a rating and review at iTunes. And thank you for supporting this podcast. You can join other supporters by becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/ColleenPatrick-Goudreau for the animals. Thanks for listening to Animology, changing the way we talk and think about other animals.